Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to learn a little bit about the different types of taxes, review how taxes affect supply and demand, and then we'll finish with asking the question, who bears the burden of a tax, which is a concept known as tax incidence. So let's get started. So in this first section, it's just a little bit about what taxes are and different types of ways that they kind of are examined. Here it says taxes, just definition, they're a compulsory contribution to state revenue. It's when the government says, I'm going to take your money. The government does it really for two reasons. One, it takes tax dollars to pay for government services like this YouTube channel, for instance. Tax dollars paid for the camera, they pay for the labor. So you've got capital equipment, you got labor, and sometimes you got to pay for it. But the second reason is sometimes the government just wants to reduce the amount of transactions. And so taxes can be a good way to do that. Sometimes you want to do both. Now, there are two kind of concepts related to taxes that we're going to address now and kind of revisit at different times in the semester, and more just terms to know. There are different ways that we talk about how taxes affect people. And so this is saying a progressive tax would be one, for example, that as your income increases, you pay a larger share of your income in taxes. So we have a progressive, for example, income tax structure actually in the United States, where as your income rises, the proportion that you pay in taxes gets larger and larger. Now, a proportional tax system is not the same. A proportional tax would be that as your income rises, you pay the same share of your income in taxes. So if your income goes up by 10%, you pay 10% more in taxes. Now, the deal here is that everybody would pay the same flat rate. And at first that may seem really simple and appealing, but it can often burden people who are lower income who are trying to make ends meet. So oftentimes you have this trade-off between a simplicity of a proportional or also known as a flat tax and something that's more equitable where folks would feel like lower income people have a greater burden by paying those taxes, whereas higher income people would have less of a burden. Now, regressive taxes work the opposite of a progressive tax. As your income rises, you actually pay smaller and smaller amounts of your income in that tax. And it's a little tricky to see those because most of the time we don't want taxes to be regressive, intentionally anyways. But an example of a regressive tax would be sales taxes. Think of it this way. If you have one person who's earning $20,000 a year, most of what they're buying is going to be subject in some way to sales taxes. Maybe not most of it, but a large part of it. And so at the end of the year, maybe the total amount of their income of that $20,000 that they spent on sales taxes was $200. That would be 1% of their income. But the same person who earns maybe $20 million a year, a majority of what they're earning is probably not going to be subject to sales taxes. In fact, a very small portion. Now, the overall amount that they pay in sales taxes, the $20 million earner, is going to be way more than $200. But as a percentage of their income, it's going to be really fairly low. That's because of that $20 million, they're probably going to save several $1 million in stocks, bonds, and real estate, and then they're going to buy some other things with it that maybe aren't subject to sales taxes. So again, we often describe those types of taxes as regressive because as the income of the person rises, they actually pay a smaller share in that particular tax. Now, there are different types of taxes also in terms of how they work. In this class, we've already talked about per unit or excise taxes. That's another name for them. These are ones where every time a unit is sold, it just adds a little bit of cost. It shifts the supply curve and creates a new price and quantity, which we've seen before. There's another type of tax called a lump sum tax. These often masquerade as things like fees for licenses, if you're running a business, for example. And you might have to pay, say, $500 just to have a license to own a business. You might be wondering, why would I have to pay $500 to have a license just to have a business? It's just really a tax. And it's a lump sum. It doesn't matter how many units you produce, how much you sell. It's just a fixed amount. So at the end of the day, that's not going to change our supply curve. It's just going to reduce the amount we get to keep in profit. Now, a third type of tax, which we've talked about in this class, is a tariff. These are per unit taxes on imports only, and so they don't change the domestic supply curve, but they do change the world price. There are other types of taxes out there. One of the more well-known ones is an ad valorem tax. Ad valorem taxes just mean to the value of. It's a percentage-based tax like a sales tax. These are really hard to model in an algebra-based econ class, along with things like income taxes. So for the most part, we're not going to be playing around with ad valorem taxes in an intro econ class. Now let's draw our per unit tax graph. This is one that's really common on exams, and it's pretty useful to understand because it illustrates our next concept nicely. So the first part is demand and supply, or supply and demand. And we do want to go ahead and put on here maybe a Q star and a P star. And then we're going to show a per unit tax and label some of these things that we kind of know about. Now, a per unit tax is going to shift that supply curve up vertically by the amount of the tax. And it's going to cause there to be a new equilibrium here. Now, I'm not given a listing here to tell me like that I need a quantity, but I'm just going to go ahead and put quantity tax so that I remember this is reducing the amount of taxes. Then we're going to go across and we're going to label the price that the buyers paid. Now we know from another video as well that if the buyer is paying this much, and we've got this vertical distance between the S curve and the ST curve, that vertical distance is the amount of the tax. And so if the buyer pays PB and we subtract the amount of the tax, we go to the original supply curve and we can find what the seller gets to keep. So the seller keeps what's on the original supply curve, the buyer pays along this demand curve where the S tax curve intercepts. The amount of the tax in the per unit is here, right? That's the per unit amount. And let's go ahead and check off some boxes here, PB, PS, per unit. And now we've got 4 areas that we're going to label on our graph. Now, the producer surplus is our first area listed. That's going to go from the price that the producers get to keep, and it's going to go down to the original supply curve. So our producer surplus is going to be a little smaller. Now, our buyers, consumer surplus, the buyers are paying here. And it's going to go up the original demand curve, just like we saw with originally consumer surplus, but it's a little bit smaller than what it would have been as well. So we've got a little triangle of consumer and a little triangle of producer surplus. And we know that the per unit amounts of the tax is this vertical distance right here, between the ST and the S curve, or between here and here. Now, we also know that the amount we're selling is QT. So if I said it was a $2 tax and you sold 10 quantity, you would know that the government collects 2 times 10, $20. And we can see that in the graph. This area, the box right here, from the vertical of the amount of the tax over to QT is the amount of tax revenue that gets collected. So that's the amount the government gets to keep. Now, the last part, consumer tax revenue, is deadweight loss. Now, deadweight loss is the value of the transactions that didn't happen because of this government intervention. And it's actually fairly easy to see them. They're the area of the surplus that we lost, that didn't get turned into something else. So I'm just shading it here. I'm going to put a little arrow and say deadweight loss. That triangle right there is actually pointing us toward, like an arrowhead, pointing us toward that Q star, P star location. And the deadweight loss is the lost value to society of intervening in this market. And so that's how we kind of label surpluses, deadweight loss, and tax revenue in terms of per unit taxes. Now let's take a look at our last concept, because understanding this one about tax revenue and deadweight loss can help us understand this last part. Tax incidence. Tax incidence asks the question of who is really paying a tax. You might think that when you buy something and it prints the amount of tax on the receipt, that's the amount that you paid, but that's not true. What actually happens is that when there's a tax, it's going to cause the price to go up a little bit that you pay, but the price that the seller gets to keep is also going to go down a little bit. Let me explain. As you shift these two curves, the new amount that the buyer pays, PB, is going to be higher than P star. And the amount the seller gets to keep, PS, is going to be less, because that tax is kind of driving a wedge in between them. What we're asking when we ask about who's really paying is who is losing more of their surplus. And so it's not as simple as looking at the receipt. It actually depends on which one is more elastic. And I have a simple way to remember it. Whichever of the two functions, the demand or the supply, whichever is more elastic, escapes paying the tax, and the other pays more of it. So for example, a per unit tax on cigarettes, really inelastic demand and pretty elastic supply. And because of that, the sellers are going to be able to pass that tax on to the buyers. The buyers are going to bear the burden because they can't escape it. They're not very elastic. What about a sales tax on yachts, where the demand is really elastic? It's a luxury good, it's not a necessity, and it's pretty inelastic actually in terms of supply. Well, if you put a tax on yachts, as Congress actually did quite a long time ago, they thought they were going to make millionaires pay it. But in fact, where it really hurt were the very working class people who were building the boats, because the rich people just said, forget it, I'll go find something else to buy instead of a fancy yacht. Now, This picture pair at the bottom, gasoline and parking spaces, shows you this concept. And so if you have these notes, you can kind of take a look at what this actually means. But I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can maybe see this picture a little bit better. Now, this picture says we've got a $1 tax per gallon. And originally, the consumers were paying $2 and the sellers were receiving $2. And you can see that the supply curve is really elastic and the demand curve is much more inelastic. As a consequence, the new equilibrium point is way higher in terms of price for the buyer. But the seller, they only gave up 5 cents. So the buyer pays most of this tax. The buyer pays 95 cents out of every dollar on this. And that's pretty common with taxes on gasoline. Now let's take a look at a price of a parking space. Here you see the demand is pretty elastic, but it's pretty inelastic supply. You could imagine why. It's pretty hard to create new parking spaces out of thin air. And so if we put a tax on parking spaces of $5, what we find is that the new equilibrium value is actually going to be way, way lower for the sellers, whereas the buyers are actually going to only see their price rise a little bit. Where does this all land? Whichever one is more elastic escapes paying the tax. If they have equal elasticity values, then they equally split the tax. One last question for you. What about maybe a tax on insulin? Who's going to pay it? The big pharma company that makes the insulin or the diabetics who need to buy it? Think about that one. Think about which one's more elastic, which one's more inelastic. Well, the diabetics have really inelastic demand because it's a necessity. And so, in fact, putting a tax on insulin just hurts the diabetics. They pay more of it because their demand is more inelastic than the supply, which is more elastic. So hopefully this helped you understand a little bit about tax incidence, about drawing the graphs of taxes and the basic terms. I'll see you next time.